Welcome to the Philosophy Iceberg. If you're not already familiar with the Iceberg memes, it's basically a way of organizing topics related to a subject from the most popular to the most obscure. Towards the start of the iceberg, you'll find a lot of philosophical ideas that you might encounter in an introductory course on philosophy. And towards the bottom of the iceberg, you'll find more obscure and complicated concepts, which get increasingly weird and spicy the further down you go.
Yeah, boy.
And sure, I know that other people have made philosophy icebergs before, but nothing quite like this one. Another one I found was by Infinity Sun on YouTube, who focused more on individual philosophers. The iceberg meme I'm using is from the Reddit user Dead Spark, and it focuses more on specific concepts rather than philosophers themselves, which I think will be an interesting angle. As you can probably tell from the length of this video, this is a long one. So sit back, get comfy, maybe grab some snacks or a cup of coffee or tea, and strap in. Rationalism and empiricism. So rationalism is the view that reason is the main source and test of knowledge. Determining truth is not understood as a sensory process, but an intellectual and deductive process. And some important rationalist figures include Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz. And traditionally, rationalism was contrasted with empiricism, which holds that knowledge comes primarily from sensory experience. Some important empiricist figures include Francis Bacon, John Locke, and David Hume. Solipsism. So solipsism is the idea that only one's mind is sure to exist, and that the external world or other minds cannot be known and might not even exist in the first place. I made a video talking a bit about this and how it relates to the dead internet theory and the NPC meme, if you're interested in that. Basing politics off of fiction. So I'm not totally sure what this one refers to, but my best guess is that it's how often people call any possible set of regulations or government action as literally 1984, referencing the novel by George Orwell. Democracy is good. This one is pretty self-explanatory. A political system where the public decides who governs is good. Simulation theory. So this is the idea that everything we perceive as the external world is actually a matrix-like simulation being run at some higher level of reality, and none of this is actually real. I made a video criticizing this position in the past, and chances are that's how you found my channel, since it's my most popular video. Politics is between liberalism and conservatism. So, from what I could tell, this is basically the idea that political beliefs exist on a spectrum between left and right, which leaves out the classic second axis in the political compass of authoritarianism versus libertarianism. Knowledge is a true justified belief. So justified true belief was a popular theory of knowledge during the Enlightenment, and it basically states that in order to know that some proposition is true, you must not only believe it, but you must also have justification in believing it. And there's a famous objection to this view of knowledge which will appear in a later layer. Science makes philosophy redundant. So the philosopher Daniel Dennett has a pretty good quote arguing against this. There is no such thing as philosophy-free science. There is only science whose philosophical baggage is taken on board without examination. Free speech is good. This one is also self-explanatory. When you can say what you want without being penalized, society good. Nihilism. So nihilism is a family of perspectives in philosophy that reject things like objective truth, morality, values, or meaning. Support for human rights. Another self-explanatory one. There's going to be a lot of these in these early layers. Human rights are good because humans don't deserve to be mistreated. Direct realism and indirect realism. So these are two opposing perspectives about the nature of conscious experience. Indirect or representative realism is the idea that our conscious experience is not the real world itself, but an internal representation, or a miniature kind of virtual replica of the world. This virtual replica system can fall into the homuncular fallacy, which causes an infinite regress. If some agent in our mind is interpreting these representations, then how is that agent interpreting it? Does it also have a smaller agent inside its mind interpreting those, and so on? On the other side of things, there's naive realism, or direct realism, which is the idea that our senses provide us with direct awareness of objects as they really are. So these aren't representations of the external world, but they actually are objects in the external world. Modern Stoicism. So this is referring to the recent cultural revival of Stoic philosophy. This isn't really surprising, given how practical Stoicism is compared to other more metaphysical schools of philosophy. Stoicism is concerned with living a good life and being a good person, which a lot of people really want to do. William B. Irvine is probably the figure I'm most familiar with in this movement, and I would definitely recommend his stuff if you want to get into contemporary Stoicism. And to throw in another plug here, I also made a video about Stoic techniques if you want to check that out as well. God exists, or God doesn't exist. The theists say that God definitely exists, 100%. The atheists say that God definitely doesn't exist, no shot. And the agnostics say, well, I don't know, it's impossible for humans to know.
The Lord may or may not be real. Who is to say?
Basic idealism. So the most basic form of idealism, as I understand it, is George Berkeley's idealism. He argues that material objects in the external world do not exist, and only exist in the realm of the mind and ideas. He has a few arguments for this, and here are a couple of those. The veil of perception argument. In response to John Locke, Berkeley points out that Locke doesn't argue how secondary qualities, things like color, taste, or smell, can result from primary qualities, things like size and shape. Berkeley asks why God would create an external world in the first place to causally generate our ideas when he could just create our ideas directly. The challenge argument. Try to conceive of an object that is unconceived. You can't extract the thing being represented from the representation, so the distinction between real objects and the representation is still nested in ideas. Okay, so outside of Berkeley, idealism is also often attributed to Indian philosophy, like the Vedanta schools of thought, as well as Mahayana Buddhism and Christian Neoplatonism. And there are also other forms of idealism that appeared later in the Western tradition too, like Immanuel Kant's transcendental idealism and German idealism. And more recently, Bernardo Kastrup is a contemporary philosopher who aligns himself with analytical idealism. The School of Life. The School of Life is a company that runs a YouTube channel with over 7 million subscribers, who often make videos about philosophy. It's a very popular channel among people getting into philosophy for the first time, but most people who are actually well-versed in philosophy tend to criticize it for inaccurate representations of the views of various philosophers and weak philosophical arguments. The YouTuber Big Joel also made a really good video criticizing some of the more general, non-philosophical, self-help type of content that the School of Life makes as well. Hume's Fork. So starting off level 2, we have Hume's Fork, one of the most famous views in epistemology, the branch of philosophy that concerns itself with knowledge.
Knowledge.
And Hume argues that truth can only be true in one of two ways. The first of these is relations of ideas, or necessary truth, and these include things like all vixens are foxes, all bachelors are unmarried, or things like the Pythagorean theorem. And the other way to achieve truth is matters of fact, or contingent truth. An example of this would be, you are watching this video on YouTube right now. You can't prove matters of fact by negation, or finding contradictions. It must be traced back to direct experience. Cogito ergo sum. So this is probably one of the most famous quotes in all of philosophy, and was a supposedly self-evident claim made by Descartes. So Descartes, in his meditations, tried to systematically doubt everything he could to try to find the fundamental fabric of existence, from which philosophy can start to build knowledge. He discovers that if he is doubting in the first place, there must be some entity which is doing the doubting, at least a thinking thing, not necessarily a material thing with a body. And this is his fundamental, indubitable truth premise. I think, therefore I am. Property dualism. So property dualism is a position in the philosophy of mind, which is, as you might expect, a type of dualist position. Property dualism holds that the universe is composed of one kind of fundamental substance, the physical kind. But there are two distinct properties, physical properties and mental properties. And this position is contrasted with substance dualism, which is the idea that physical matter and the mind or consciousness are two separate substances. Dualism as a whole is also a small subset of the various positions in the study of consciousness. There are also physicalists who believe that only the physical world exists. There are panpsychists who believe that consciousness is some kind of fundamental property of reality, and idealism, which I was talking about earlier. And these positions also split off into loads of different subpositions. If you're curious, there's a great video by the philosopher Matt Segal, which describes all of this in depth. Antinatalism. Antinatalism is the idea that having children is morally wrong. The main argument for this position is the idea that procreation is essentially a non-consensual process by which you send a human being into the world, which is often painful and dangerous. Essentially, minimizing the inherent suffering in life by not having children is considered more morally important than maximizing the potential happiness that might be created. And there are also arguments about the inherent harm human lives cause to non-human animals, and the inherent environmental impact that humans cause throughout their lives. I don't have the time to make arguments against this position here, even though I really disagree with it. But you can hit that subscription button and ring the bell if you're interested, because I'll probably make a video about that in the future as well. Determinism versus free will. So this is one of the most classic debates in philosophy. Free will is the capacity for agents like humans to choose between different possible courses of action. Concepts like moral responsibility, praise, and guilt are all dependent on this ability to freely choose your actions. This is contrasted with determinism, which is the idea that all events are completely determined by previous causes. A choice I make can be understood as the result of neural activity in my brain, which is basically caused by my upbringing, as well as my inherent characteristics and dispositions I was born with, etc., all leading back to the creation of the universe. If that's the case, then moral responsibility, praise, and guilt don't make any sense, because the actions you carry out were the result of things you can't control, and any sense of agency is just an illusion. Some philosophers, like David Hume, have argued that free will and determinism are actually compatible, which is a view surprisingly called compatibilism. Absurdism. The absurd is all about the conflict between human desire to find meaning and value in life, and our inability to actually find these with any certainty. The most famous absurdist philosopher, Albert Camus, described this in his essay The Myth of Sisyphus. He compares the absurdity of human life with Sisyphus, the figure in Greek mythology who is condemned to continuously push a boulder up a mountain, watch it roll down again, and then do it all over again, forever. Camus argued that we should embrace this absurd condition of our existence, which is encapsulated in the final line of his essay. The struggle itself is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. Causation isn't empirical. My best guess for this one is that it's talking about Hume's analysis of causation. So drawing from Hume's fork, which I explained at the beginning of this layer, he argues that causal reasoning has a problem. You can't deduce causal truth from relations of ideas, because negating a causal claim does not entail a contradiction. The causal claim, when I let go of this pen, it will fall, negates to, when I let go of this pen, it will not fall. The second claim is obviously untrue, but it's still an intelligible claim. It's not false a priori. You also can't get at causal...
shiploads. And not a moment too soon. Would you believe it? It's time to finish with the construction here and move on to new, more exciting things. Just plan a route for the repair crews from the concrete slabs facility to the river lock and get yourself across.
Truth from matters of fact, because it presupposes the uniformity of nature. You might say, every time I let go of a pen, it falls. So this time, when I let go of the pen, it will fall. Just because up until this point that's always been the case, that doesn't logically imply that it will always be the case. It's a circular argument, or in other words, it begs the question, why is the universe uniform? Well, because it has been previously. Hume concludes that our causal predictions don't come from reason, they come from custom or habit. We have some innate capacity for constructing causal beliefs, which is an aspect of our psychology. Deontological ethics. Deontological ethics is the ethical theory that the morality of an action is based on a series of rules. This is in opposition to consequentialists, who believe the morality of an action is based on its consequences. The most famous version of this is probably Kant's categorical imperative. Act only according to that maxim, which you can also will that it would become a universal law. This basically means that you shouldn't do something if you wouldn't like it if everybody in the world also did it. Things like stealing are wrong in this view, because you wouldn't want everybody to be stealing things constantly. The continental analytic split. A lot of people distinguish philosophy into two main groups. The first is continental philosophy, which comprises things like German idealism, phenomenology, existentialism, structuralism, post-structuralism, critical theory, and loads of other things. And the second is analytic philosophy, which includes figures like Frege, Bertrand Russell, G.E. Moore, and Ludwig Wittgenstein, along with the logical positivists. Analytic philosophy tends to emphasize language in clear, rigorous arguments with formal logic. In contrast, continental philosophy tends to draw from the Kantian idea that philosophical reflection is the best way to answer questions about knowledge, experience, and reality, rather than just empirical or logical inquiry. A common criticism of this divide is that continental philosophy emerged as a concept to act as a label for the types of philosophy that the analytic philosophers just didn't like very much. Gettier cases. So the Gettier case is a famous objection to the justified true belief theory of knowledge that I talked about in Layer 1. Consider a murder trial. The accused person is guilty, and the jury believes this. But even though the accused person is guilty, the evidence they used in court was entirely fabricated. So even though the belief is justified and true, in this case, the truth is not appropriately related to the justification of the belief. Existentialism. Existentialism is a school of philosophy that's usually associated with figures like Kierkegaard, Dostoevsky, Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, and Frantz Fanon. The main premises of this school is that there is no meaning in the world in itself. There is no God, and there is no objective morality. Sartre claimed that existence precedes essence. We must create our own moral systems and values, rather than having them pre-endowed. Simone de Beauvoir explored the relationship between existential and social freedom, and argued that even though there is no objective good and evil, constraining the freedom of others through power is still what they call bad faith. Pessimism. Pessimism is the view that life and existence have a negative value because the volume of pain in existence tends to outweigh the pleasure. The fact that we are self-conscious is seen as a tragic side effect of evolution. We're forced to contemplate our place in the universe, and we just want a meaningful existence with a lack of pain, sickness, and death, even though we can never achieve this. Arthur Schopenhauer is probably the most famous figure of this view. Utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is a type of consequentialist ethics, which argues that we should always try to maximize happiness and well-being through our actions. This view was founded by Jeremy Bentham, who understood utility as that property in any object, whereby it tends to produce benefit, advantage, pleasure, good, or happiness, or to prevent the happening of mischief, pain, evil, or unhappiness to the party whose interest is considered. Some other famous utilitarians include John Stuart Mill and the contemporary philosopher Peter Singer. Ancient Stoicism. This is a layer deeper than contemporary Stoicism, since you gotta get it straight from the source. The main figures associated with it are Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and Seneca. I won't go too deep into Stoicism here because I already did in this other video, so I'm just gonna plug that again. Plato was right about democracy. So Plato thought that democracy isn't as good as it sounds, because the skills you need to rule are different from the skills you need to win an election. Plato would say that rulers should be chosen by reason and wisdom, rather than the rhetoric and persuasion you need to win an election. In Plato's ideal society, it is ruled by philosopher kings. Virtue ethics. This is a system of ethics developed by Aristotle and other ancient Greek philosophers. In contrast to consequential or deontological ethics, virtue ethics emphasizes the individual's character. In this view, as long as we focus on being good people, we'll end up naturally doing the right things. Aristotle identified about 18 core virtues that everyone should strive towards achieving, and each of these virtues is understood as the golden mean between corresponding excesses and deficiencies. For example, courage is understood as the golden mean between rashness and cowardice. Marxism. Oh boy, something material conditions, the mode of production influencing society, the base and superstructure. Honestly, if you want to understand Marxism, the best thing I can suggest is checking out the lecture series Reading Marxist Capital with David Harvey, which is all on YouTube. He will explain it much better than I could ever hope to. Optimism. This isn't just the glass half full idea that everything will just work itself out in the end. This is a philosophical idea that's usually associated with Leibniz, who argued that we live in the best of all possible worlds. His argument basically goes like this. God has the idea of infinitely many universes. Only one of these universes can actually exist. God's choices are subject to the principle of sufficient reason. That is, God has a reason to choose one thing or another. God is good. Therefore, the universe that God chose to exist is the best of all possible worlds. Metaethics. In the same way that metaphysics goes beyond physics, metaethics goes beyond ethics. Metaethicists deal with questions like, what do moral judgments even mean? Is morality objective? Or how can we know whether moral judgments are true? The world of forms. This is Plato's metaphysics, which claims that the physical world is not the real or true world, and that what is actually real is the absolute ideas or forms that underpin what we would usually understand as real. In this view, everything we perceive in the world are just imitations of the non-physical essences of what they are. Humanism. This is a pretty broad and vague philosophical stance that emphasizes human beings as the starting point for philosophical inquiry. It's also usually associated with secularism and a reliance on science and reason. For a humanist, you don't need religion to determine your values and morals. You can achieve a good and meaningful life by shaping your own values. Aesthetics. Contrary to popular belief, this isn't just the vaporwave meme of spacing out the letters and text. It's a branch of philosophy that concerns itself with the nature of beauty and what we find pleasing when we're looking at visual art, or listening to music, or reading poetry, or just wandering through nature. JBP on postmodernism. This refers to the controversial Canadian psychologist Jordan B. Peterson and his profound misunderstanding of postmodern philosophy, like its interchangeability with Marxism, for instance. If you want to deep dive into this, there's a really good video by CCK Philosophy on the subject. Plato had no beliefs, it was all Socrates. Socrates famously didn't write down any of his thoughts because he valued the back and forth dialogue that happens in conversation and felt that writing was too authoritative. Because there are a lot of contradictory accounts of Socrates, it's pretty much impossible to figure out his actual philosophy. A lot of what we know about Socrates comes from him being a main character in a lot of Plato's dialogues. Most historians believe that in the later dialogues, Plato used Socrates as a mouthpiece for his own ideas. And this entry of the meme claims that everything Plato wrote was all just Socrates, and Plato didn't have any beliefs of his own. Radical freedom. Sartre. The central idea of the existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre is radical freedom and responsibility, writing that we are condemned to be free. We're thrown into the world without choice. We just kind of show up here as humans. But now we're responsible for everything we do. This is tied to his idea that existence precedes essence. Only the individual determines one's character, goals, purpose, and so on. Hegel is thesis, antithesis, synthesis. This is talking about Hegel's dialectics, which is used to study things in order to make implicit contradictions explicit. This process involves a thesis, which gives rise to a reaction, the antithesis, which contradicts or negates the thesis, and the tension between the thesis and antithesis become resolved through a synthesis. This is probably the most popular aspect of Hegel's thought, but from what I've read, it's really not as significant as it's made out to be. It definitely appears sometimes, but it's not a dominant element of his work. One thing that is dominant is triads. There's always 3 of everything. If Hegel writes about any given thing, he'll split it up into 3 parts, and then 3 component parts of that, and so on. His main intellectual move is to break things into 3 parts. Schopenhauer will. Schopenhauer drew heavily from Immanuel Kant. He interpreted Kant as showing that space, time, and causality do not exist in the world, but are features of our mind that we use to construct our experience. So it follows that the world as we experience it, with objects in space and time which have causal relationships, all depend on the mind for their existence. He described this idealist position influenced by Kant and Berkeley when he wrote, "The world is my representation." Kant believed that there must be something independent of us that mediates our representation of the external world, which we have no direct access to. Kant posited mind-independent transcendental objects, which is what causes these representations. But Schopenhauer didn't agree with this part, since he still understood causality as a feature of the mind, and did not want things in themselves of the external world to be the source of these representations in a causal kind of way. Instead of looking to something independent, Schopenhauer instead looked inward, and argued that the inner core of our being is what underlies everything. There is an unconscious instinct or force characterized by a restless striving. He called this will, and that our bodies are a manifestation of will, which he ties to the survival instinct to live, as well as the instinct to reproduce. But he also didn't reduce this just to living organisms. He believed that this will penetrates and underlies all of reality. Ready at hand. Ready at hand is part of a distinction drawn by the philosopher Heidegger to describe the attitudes we have towards things in the world. Present at hand is the neutral attitude of a scientist or a theorist who's trying to observe and make sense of something. This attitude is only concerned with the bare facts of a thing, and has no concept of its history or its utility. In contrast, ready at hand is a more involved attitude that views things as useful in order to achieve something. For example, a hammer is ready at hand, because we use it for certain purposes without any theorizing. German idealism. German idealism was a philosophical movement in, surprise surprise, Germany, which mostly grew from the work of Immanuel Kant. Some important figures include Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel. Kant's transcendental idealism, which was a bit more modest than the German idealists, still viewed things in themselves as real, and that they affect our minds and produce sensations. but we still can't have knowledge of these things in themselves based on how they appear to us. But as Fichte argued, the idea of these things in themselves, objects which are not objects for us and exist independently of consciousness, is a contradiction in terms. This is because the thing is only a thing when it is something for us. Even though there are still a lot of metaphysical differences between the main German idealists, this more radical idealism is the basis for this movement. Critical theory. Critical theory refers to a wide range of theories that take, surprisingly, a critical view of society and the human sciences. It also refers to the Frankfurt School, particularly the writings of Adorno, Marcuse, Habermas, and some others. The main goal of the critical theorists is to theorize about what's usually taken for granted, to hopefully promote a free society that removes the illusions of ideology. Rather than just trying to understand or explain society, critical theory wants to critique it and change it, drawing from all the major social sciences like economics, sociology, history, political science, psychology, geography, and more. The biggest influences on critical theory include people like Marx, Hegel, and Freud. Oedipus complex. This is probably one of the most famous ideas from psychoanalysis. Freud believed that every single young boy goes through a phase in life where he, sometimes unconsciously, hates his father and wants to have sex with his mother. This theory is named after the mythological story of Oedipus, who accidentally fulfilled the prophecy that he would kill his father and marry his mother. Pretty much all modern psychologists don't agree with this theory, but even if we take it seriously, it doesn't really make sense if you have same-sex parents, and it also totally contradicts the widespread taboo and disgust most people have towards incest. Throwness. This is another concept from Heidegger. It refers to the fact that as humans, we are thrown into the world. Without any prior consent, we're completely arbitrarily thrown into life and are met with frustrations, suffering, and responsibilities. This might remind you of Jean-Paul Sartre's idea of radical freedom that I was talking about earlier. And you would be smart to think that, because the existentialists drew heavily from Heidegger and concepts of his like thrownness. Structuralism, post-structuralism. Post-structuralism, as you might guess, is an extension of the earlier movement structuralism. Structuralism is usually associated with the Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure. Saussure looked at language, like words, and broke it up into two parts: the sound of the word, the signifier, and what the word represents, the signified. The union of the signifier and the signified is called the sign. He pointed out that the association between signifiers and signified is arbitrary. But how about this example? The word snake refers to the slithering animal with no legs, but it also refers to someone who is two-faced and backstabs you. And it could also act as part of the symbol for the World Health Organization. And these are all very different meanings. This signification works in a chain, where snake refers to an animal, which represents someone who is two-faced, which represents betrayal, which is an example of immorality, and so on. The radical post-structuralist would argue that this chain of signification is infinite. Some notable post-structuralists include Roland Barthes, Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, Gilles Deleuze, and Jean Baudrillard. If you want a more sophisticated understanding of post-structuralism, there is a great YouTube video by Christopher Bolton, who uses some intuitive diagrams to help explain it. The pleasure principle. This is another concept from Freud, which refers to the instinct of chasing pleasure and avoiding pain, which is a part of the Freudian id, the instinctual component of our personality in Freud's psychological theory. Mineness. Mineness is a characteristic of existence described by Heidegger. It refers to the fact that things don't just float around in the world, but are always there in relation to me. For Heidegger, a thing exists, but it is also there, concerning a particular perspective of being. For example, when someone tells me something, I don't just hear it in a universal, abstract kind of way, but I hear it in a particular language, at a particular place and time, and all of this gives me contextual meaning about what I'm being told. The will to power, common interpretation. The will to power is a concept in Nietzsche's work that draws from Schopenhauer. It's commonly understood that he thought it was the main driving force or instinct of humans. But this concept was not very well defined in his writings, so there's a lot of different interpretations in the literature. This power is not understood as just chasing physical power, military power, or political power. It's a much more broad concept. The will to power can manifest as the desire of the philosopher or the scientist to direct their will to truth, or the artist to direct their will to create, or the businessman to become wealthy. For Nietzsche, the world is essentially a landscape of competing forces. When these forces clash, there's resistance, and the will to power is the urge to overcome this resistance. In contrast to Schopenhauer's emphasis on Darwinian self-preservation, the will to power is a striving towards becoming more. The Society of the Spectacle. The Society of the Spectacle is a text by Guy Debord and is associated with Marxism and critical theory. Debord was a key part of the Situationist Internationale, which was an organization of artists, intellectuals, and political theorists. The Situationists pointed out that the advancement of capitalism in the 20th century caused a shift in the way we express ourselves. Rather than authentically expressing ourselves through lived experience, we instead express ourselves indirectly through consumption and commodities. This shift is seen as a big problem for society, which damages everyone's quality of life, and it's also tied to the rise of mass media, and how it has created a structure where image is more important than authentic, genuine human interaction, writing that all that was once directly lived has become mere representation. The death drive. The death drive is a concept in Freudian psychoanalysis, and it basically means what it says on the tin. It's the drive towards death and destruction, which acts in opposition to the pleasure principle. On the other hand, it could also be seen as a part of Schopenhauer's work. As I mentioned earlier, Schopenhauer understood that all of existence is a metaphysical will, which is affirmed by pleasure. His pessimistic view that life produces more suffering than happiness led to the idea that affirming the will is immoral, and that the death drive is a kind of negation of this will. Nietzsche as an existentialist. Nietzsche is commonly seen as a major influence to later movements in philosophy, like existentialism and postmodernism. The biggest connection to existentialism was Nietzsche's proclamation that God is dead. As society and culture progressed and religion became less emphasized, Nietzsche became concerned with the lack of a unifying truth to guide humanity. This laid the foundation for existentialism, with the claims that there is no meaning in the world itself, there is no God, and there is no objective morality. Understanding Hegel. Hegel's work, particularly the phenomenology of spirit, is notorious for being extremely difficult to understand. Part of this might have to do with the translation from German, but the ideas he explores are also extremely complicated. To truly understand exactly how dense this work is, I'll just say that this guy, Gregory B. Sadler on YouTube, created a series of 339 half-hour videos, which each explore a single paragraph of the phenomenology of spirit. Supposedly, once you reach level 4, you can finally understand Hegel. LAC, RAC, UAC. These are all sects of accelerationism, the philosophy of Nick Land. Accelerationism is basically the idea that the societal processes we're witnessing now, like capitalist growth and technological change, should be accelerated and intensified as much as possible to create radical social change, which might include a potential technological singularity. LAC refers to leftists who accept accelerationism, and RAC refers to people on the right who accept accelerationism, and UAC refers to unconditional accelerationism. Deconstruction. This is an approach to philosophy created by Jacques Derrida. Don't be confused by the name. It's not about deconstructing or taking apart an argument. Derrida was concerned with logocentrism, which is the assumption that absolute truth can be discovered through language. He thought that this logocentrism was a major mistake in the history of Western philosophy, and wanted to argue that the subjective nature of language makes it a useless pursuit. Derrida believed that much of this logocentrism in philosophy has to do with binaries, like nature versus culture, speech versus writing, man versus woman, heterosexual versus homosexual. He points out that binaries usually involve a primary or privileged side, which we usually list first, like light and dark, hot and cold, good and bad, high and low, inside and outside, speech and writing, and so on. He argues that it's actually the unprivileged term that sets the conditions for the binary itself, which identifies how the two opposing sides of the binary are not as separate as we might initially think. We can't have a concept of darkness without lightness, and vice versa. This exposes how the cutoff point between each side of the binary is not static. It's always relative and can shift back and forth. Bertrand Russell was a psyop. Bertrand Russell was a British philosopher, mathematician, and logician, who is most well known as one of the founders of analytic philosophy, and he wrote Principia Mathematica with Alfred North Whitehead, which was a major development of classical logic. Along with G.E. Moore, he was part of the British revolt against idealism, which was the dominant perspective of British philosophy at the time. He wrote that, with a sense of escaping a prison, we allowed ourselves to think that grass is green, that the sun and stars would exist if no one was aware of them. A psychological operation, or a psyop, is a form of psychological warfare, where some authority attempts to invoke a pre-planned psychological reaction in the population. An example of this comes from the Vietnam War, which involved the United States running a number of psychological operations, including playing tapes of distorted human sounds during the night to make the Vietnamese soldiers think that their dead enemies were back for revenge. This entry in the Iceberg jokingly claims that Bertrand Russell himself was all a psyop of some kind. So the conspiracy goes, Bertrand Russell was sponsored by the British government to bring down philosophy by creating the analytic continental split. Nietzsche through post-structuralism. This is referring to the association between Nietzsche's philosophy and the later movement of post-structuralism in the 20th century. I don't know too much about the literature on this, but I did find some interesting parallels. One connection is that Nietzsche famously criticized Socrates and Descartes, who the post-structuralists also criticized. Nietzsche was also very concerned with binary oppositions, like good and evil, or the Christ and Antichrist, which might remind you of Derrida's deconstruction, and how that relates to the reversal of binary pairs. Nietzsche's famous quote, "There are no facts, only interpretations," also mirrors Derrida's quote, "There is nothing outside the text." Schizoanalysis. Schizoanalysis is a concept attributed to the work of postmodernist philosophers Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, which is present in their books Anti-Oedipus and 1,000 Plateaus. It could be understood as a new materialist approach to psychiatry, which was developed in response to the shortcomings of psychoanalysis. In opposition to psychoanalysis, schizoanalysis also emphasizes the social and economic contexts as a driver for mental illness, and challenges the idea that it is a defect of some kind. While psychoanalysis tries to arrive at a higher level authoritative judgment of psychopathologies, schizoanalysis forces us to see mental illness in the context of the material environment. Desiring production. This is also a concept in the work of Deleuze and Guattari. It's based on a fundamental disagreement with Freud. Freud believed that the unconscious is a representational theater where a desire is always tied to a lack. Instead, Deleuze and Guattari argue that desire is an actual productive force. Desire is a positive process without a lack. This desiring machine is also embedded in a larger context of other interconnected desiring machines. They write, "There are no desiring machines that exist outside the social machines that they form on a large scale, and no social machines without the desiring machines that inhabit them on a small scale." The body without organs. This is also a concept in the work of Deleuze and Guattari. It's a pretty complicated concept, but my understanding is it basically refers to an abstract structure of components without any imposed organization. You can think about it as a machine that frees the human animal from instincts and social influence. It's a body that has the capacity to settle into a bunch of different functions and forms, without yet taking on any of those functions and forms. It's like a collection of potentialities. Rhizomes. In the plant sciences, a rhizome is a plant stem that sends out roots from its nodes, growing horizontally. In the philosophy of Deleuze and Guattari, they use rhizome as a concept to describe systems that have no clear beginning or end, like the internet. These systems are non-hierarchical, and are described in contrast to arborescent structures, which are basically tree-like hierarchies. They apply this structure to culture. Instead of conceptualizing culture as a chronological narrative, it understands it as a map, or a set of attractions and influences with no precise origin. The will to power. Deleuze interpretation. Deleuze understood Nietzsche's concept of the will to power in a backwards kind of way. He writes, "Power, as a will to power, is not that which the will wants, but that which wants in the will." Power doesn't mean that the will wants power, or wishes to dominate, but power animates the will. Power is inseparable from willing. There is no willing without power. Disciplinary society. This concept comes from the French postmodernist philosopher Michel Foucault. He argues that the mechanisms of discipline that emerged in institutions like schools and prisons have expanded out to society as a whole. Foucault takes Jeremy Bentham's idea of a panopticon, the modern structure for a jail, where there is a watchtower in the middle and separate cells surrounding it. Prisoners in the panopticon can't see each other or the guard, but the guard can see everybody. This creates a scenario where you don't know when you're being watched, so you always have to act as if you were. The prisoner becomes his own guard. This is a very efficient structure, because you can exert control over a lot of people with very minimal effort, since you only need one guard, or maybe even no guards. Foucault claims that the panopticon is not just an architectural structure of prisons, but it's a paradigmatic case of a technology of power, panopticism. It's the way in which we organize social spaces and the people within it to make it as productive, efficient, and obedient as possible. Once this panopticon expands throughout the whole market economy, we live in a society. We live in a disciplinary society. The Accursed Share. The Accursed Share is a book about political economy written by Georges Bataille. He presents an economic theory that he calls general economy. A problem Bataille identifies is that economics studies its phenomena in isolation, and doesn't take into account how economic activity affects the world, or how the world affects economic activity. He calls this restrictive economy. Bataille understands the accursed share as the excessive part of the economy that has to be spent on luxury without any gain, like on non-procreative sexuality, spectacles, war, and so on. The growth or expansion of an organism always reaches some limit that prohibits further growth, so the excess energy must be wasted on luxury. The nature of a society is understood as the form and role of this luxury. Limit experience. The idea of a limit experience is another concept associated with Georges Bataille. Limit experiences are a type of experience that approaches the edge of living in its intensity, which breaks down the boundaries of pain and pleasure. At one point in his life, someone showed Bataille a photograph of someone experiencing lingqi, or death by 1,000 cuts, which is a Chinese torture method where someone's body is slowly cut into pieces. Bataille hung this photograph on his wall and looked at it pretty often. He saw it as an example of these limit experiences. He noticed that the victim's face looked almost blissful, and he wrote that he was struck by the fact that these two complete contrasts were identical: divine ecstasy and extreme horror. Bataille attempted to live his life at the edge of limits, where one's ability to even comprehend experience breaks down. Cybernetics. Cybernetics is a science defined by Norbert Wiener, a mathematician and philosopher. It refers to the study of communication in control theory, emphasizing how automatic control systems compare, like the biological nervous system, technological systems, and social systems. The word cybernetics comes from the Greek word that means to steer. As we steer a ship, we're trying to move towards a goal while we get blown off course with wind, which causes us to constantly correct our trajectory to stay moving towards the goal. From a cybernetic perspective, All intelligent systems have this property of trying things, acting, seeing what's happened, changing actions, and looping through this process in a self-correcting way. Hyperreality. Hyperreality is a concept introduced by the postmodern philosopher Baudrillard in Simulacra and Simulation. It's about how, as conscious beings, we can't distinguish reality from a simulation of reality, especially in the technologically advanced society we live in today. It's a condition where what is real and what is fiction are seamlessly blended together, and we can't tell where one ends and the other begins. Now, this simulation isn't the Nick Bostrom idea that all of reality is a kind of matrix computer simulation, but instead, how modern mass media and cultural symbols have changed the way we construct and interface with reality. A good example Baudrillard uses is Disneyland, which is an intense cascade of symbols which all serve to preserve and communicate the magic of Disney products and media, which is more real than real. A lot of the Disney symbols have their roots in European fairy tales, which have continuously evolved over hundreds of years, slowly shifting away from the underlying reality they actually represented. At this point, all the symbols of Disneyland are many steps removed from reality. With Disneyland, it's fairly obvious that this fantasy world is not real, but there are other examples that are a bit more subtle, like a hamburger from McDonald's. When you decide to get a double cheeseburger, you tend to imagine the double cheeseburger presented to you in advertisements, rather than the actual burger they'll end up serving you, which is usually pretty soggy and pathetic. The way that we act and perceive the world through these idealized, fabricated symbols is what Baudrillard means when he says that we live in a hyperreality. The nomadic war machine. This is another concept from Deleuze and Guattari. We haven't escaped them quite yet. In simple terms, the war machine is an abstract concept that refers to that which allows for possibility. This is understood in opposition to the state, which is concerned with limiting possibility. But at the same time, the war machine can also be co-opted by the state itself to serve its own ends, and at this point, the war machine becomes associated with actual military war. So they claim that the origin of the war machine is connected to nomadic people who have no set place to live, and they just wander around. Nomadic people are contrasted with the state, which wants to organize and regulate the physical world. The nomadic attitude just passes through the world and doesn't try to impose any organization onto it. We are ultimately nothing but an effect of the sun. I think this is in reference to Georges Bataille's theory of general economy, which I talked a little bit about in the previous level. Bataille points out that the sun is the ultimate source of all life and wealth on Earth that's needed to sustain growth, life, and reproduction. But this sunlight is excessive. It produces way more energy than is actually used by the life that it facilitates. This solar excess is necessary for life to also be excessive. Rather than understanding organisms as some kind of rational actors motivated by scarcity, like they do in classical economics, Bataille understands organisms to have an excess of energy available to it, which can be used productively for growth or sustainability, or just expended on luxury. Hegel and hermeneutics. Hegel was a major figure in the development of hermeneutics, which is the theory of interpretation. One major idea he made popular was that it's not just linguistic texts and spoken phrases that require interpretation, but also non-linguistic arts like architecture, paintings, and instrumental music. Nowadays, it's just taken for granted that hermeneutics can be applied to non-linguistic communication, but that's all thanks to Hegel. Blockchain solves the space-time problem. This is in reference to a YouTube video by Nick Land from 2016, where he tries to argue for a relationship between blockchain technology and the philosophy of time. The problem of space-time, according to Einstein, is that there's no such thing as absolute succession, so there can't be time in a sense that is distinct from a dimension, and this is why space-time is treated as a fourth dimensional structure. This is because if you have two clocks in different parts of space, it's very hard to establish if they are synchronized, because any signal you send from one clock to another will take time. Even if you're sending signals at the speed of light, there's still a lag. The Bitcoin white paper, which outlines the proof-of-work blockchain, is supposedly able to solve the synchronization problem, which Land claims is identical to the space-time problem. The political compass is a hyperstition. Hyperstition is a concept also created by Nick Land. A hyperstition, in simple terms, is a fiction that makes itself real, or in Nick Land's words, the experimental technoscience of self-fulfilling prophecies. An idea emerges in culture and then causes a positive feedback cycle where it becomes real. This entry in the meme claims that the political compass, which classifies political positions on the axes of left, right, and authoritarian libertarian, is a hyperstition. So essentially, before the origin of this framework, people did not really fit into these kinds of classifications. But after the framework emerged in culture, people's perspectives started to conform to this framework. Tribute explains hyperreality. So I'm not totally sure about this one, but this is my best guess. I think the word tribute here might be referring to a tribute act, or an amateur band that plays covers of a well-known band. Some examples of this include the Iron Maidens, an all-female band paying tribute to Iron Maiden, or Piss, a tribute act to Kiss. The process of bands whose existence is a tribute to another band can be understood as Baudrillard's simulacrum, which is a representation or imitation of a person or thing. In Baudrillard's view, these simulacrums are not direct copies of the real, authentic thing, but they become true in their own right and become hyper-real. Kant through Nick Land, Bataille through Nick Land. Nick Land has a unique perspective on the works of Immanuel Kant as well as Georges Bataille. Let's start with his treatment of Kant, which is part of most of his work, but is closely associated with Kant, capital, and the prohibition of incest. In very simple terms, Land hated Kant. He argued that you can trace the modern structure of capitalist society to the transcendental philosophy of Immanuel Kant. As far as Bataille goes, one of Nick Land's claims to fame was his book The Thirst for Annihilation, which was the first book in English to respond to Bataille's writings. Just to remind you, Bataille was very concerned with energy expenditure and how that relates to economics. But is this structure of energy expenditure exclusive to economics? Maybe it can also be applied to cosmology. It could be that the whole universe is just a byproduct of a process of endless expenditure, an economy of consumption and excess that's totally indifferent to human thoughts and aspirations. Base materialism. This is the ontological position of Georges Bataille, which he developed to break away from mainstream materialism, which he saw as being a subtle form of idealism. He proposes an active base matter that disrupts the opposition of high and low and destabilizes all foundations. All matter is considered libidinally powered and productive, and this idea of materialism is very influenced by Gnosticism, and doesn't really have a strict definition or rationalization. Gender accelerationism. Gender accelerationism, or GAC, is an ideology about accelerating gender to the point that there's no longer any internal logic to it. To truly reach a point where the LGBTQ+ community can live without fear of any kind of discrimination, gender accelerationists argue that we must continuously create more and more genders until the whole logic of gender collapses. The solar anus. The solar anus is a short surrealist text by Georges Bataille. It's structured as a series of aphorisms that deal with topics like death and decay, natural disasters, impotence, and feces. It points out that even though the sun brings life to Earth, it can also cause death with its powerful energy. Connecting to Bataille's idea of excess, it discusses the anus as a symbol for inevitable waste or luxury. Gender hacking. From what I researched, it seems like gender hacking is a concept related to xenofeminism and feminist accelerationism. This is a niche but broad perspective associated with people like Helen Hester, and is concerned with questions like how technology can liberate women from the tyranny of their own biology. A reference point for this is Beatrice Preciado, who uses black market testosterone to hack her own body, to explore how these substances can transform her body and experience of the world, which she calls the auto guinea pig principle. God is a lobster. So when I first read this, I thought it was a reference to Jordan Peterson and his famous fascination with lobsters. But it turns out it's an out-of-context quote from Deleuze and Guattari's 1,000 Plateaus. For Deleuze, God is a lobster. A double-pincered abstract machine of natural stratification. God, in this sense, is only seen as a part of nature. And this is an important break from the Western tradition in philosophy that can be linked to figures like Aristotle and Kant, who view the organism as the judgment of God. Ultimately, the claim that God is a lobster is both tongue-in-cheek and also deadly serious. It's a critical statement that exposes the illusion of the organism as the judgment of God. Heraclitus was the first post-structuralist. Heraclitus was an ancient Greek pre-Socratic philosopher. One of his famous quotes actually has some interesting parallels with post-structural ontology, as this meme suggests. Post-structuralism broadly understands existence as being a complex process that doesn't follow the rigidity of grand narratives, which try to identify a singular, capital T truth about reality. All the processes that comprise reality are continuously in a state of transformation. Now, Heraclitus said, "You can never step in the same river twice." Plato's reading of Heraclitus interprets this as suggesting that all things are in flux, and the nature of reality is that nothing is constant except for change. Instead of reality being, reality is becoming, which really parallels the post-structuralist ontology. Societies of control. This is a reference to Deleuze's essay, Postscript on the Societies of Control. In this essay, he argues that we're in the process of entering into a new kind of society. Societies of control are in opposition to Foucault's disciplinary societies, which I talked about in Level 4. In this new society of control, imposing power doesn't require enclosing people into spaces like schools, factories, or prisons, as in the disciplinary society. In societies of control, this power is imposed throughout all of society. The smartphone is a pretty good example of this. In a disciplinary society, power must be imposed by limiting human behavior and action. But with smartphones, we're actually encouraged to use them freely, which still serves to impose power by collecting our personal data and selling it to governments and corporations. These new techniques for controlling and monitoring us aren't even seen as that at all, but as free actions we're carrying out. There's a really good video about societies of control by CCK Philosophy, if you want to dig into this a bit deeper. Baudrillard's metaphysics. So from what I can tell, most of Baudrillard's metaphysical takes come from fatal strategies, and the biggest theme has to do with the object superseding the subject. Related to his idea of hyperreality, he points out how objects in culture are continuously surpassing themselves. The beauty in the fashion industry is more beautiful than beautiful, and television is becoming more real than real, and pornographic sex is becoming more sexual than sex. This expansion and intensification of objects like goods, services, and information has reached such an extreme that it comes with a certain inertia for the subject, and these objects end up dominating and defeating the subject. The libidinal band. The libidinal band is a concept from the French postmodernist philosopher Jean-François Lyotard. A lot of Lyotard's philosophy is based around Freud's idea of the libido. In Lyotard's understanding of reality, reality doesn't consist of some kind of structure or being, but a bunch of unpredictable events, which he calls libidinal intensities and affects, which can also be understood as feelings or desires. But in a counterintuitive way, he sees this libidinal description of reality as a theoretical fiction, or a way to talk about reality that gives us useful terms for theorizing about the world. The libidinal band is like a body in the form of a Mobius strip, which serves as a surface of reality where libidinal intensities pass through. The Great Zero. The Great Zero is also a concept from Lyotard, and it's related to his critique of reason and representation. Representation is the standard model of rational thought in Western philosophy, where the human subject represents the objective world to itself in its subjective mind. For Lyotard, this model of representation has a problem, because it places the actual reality that representation refers to in a kind of transcendent realm. The Great Zero is the divide between the representation and what it represents. And this representation is seen as nihilistic, in the same way that Nietzsche sees religion as nihilistic. Religion, for Nietzsche, places the highest values in a transcendent realm that we can't access, which cuts us off from these highest values and devalues what we actually experience directly. For Lyotard, representation follows the same pattern, because we can never bridge the gap between representation and reality. So this cuts us off as representational thinkers from accessing reality. Trump is a Kantian. This is in reference to an interview on YouTube with someone who seems to be at a Trump rally. Over the course of 3 minutes, this guy goes on a very bizarre and obscure rant about how Trump will save the world by completing Kant's philosophical system, and claims that Trump is a Kantian and German idealist.
Kant! He could not complete the system of German idealism. Trump is going to complete the system. He's going to derive the complete system. German idealism. First critique, published in 1781. Trump is a Kantian.
Hyperpop is accelerationist. Hyperpop is a recent musical genre that's attributed to a lot of artists, and is usually associated with A.G. Cook and people related to his PC Music record label, including musicians like Charlie XCX and the late Sophie. Hyperpop is a very exaggerated and self-referential kind of pop music, usually characterized by brash, intense synth melodies, excessively auto-tuned vocals, and nostalgic references to 2000s internet culture. This meme claims that hyperpop is a kind of accelerationist music. Accelerationism is something I touched on earlier, and basically has to do with the idea that social processes should be intensified or accelerated as much as possible to cause social change. Thanatos and Eros in Freud's dialectic. In ancient Greek mythology, Thanatos was the personification of death, and Eros is the personification of love and sex. Freud described a dialectic between two primary instincts, Thanatos, or the death instinct, and Eros, the life instinct. While Eros is concerned with things like procreation, social cooperation, and survival, Thanatos is related to aggression, riskier self-destructive behavior, and trauma. Thanatos accelerationism. So Freud's Thanatos and Eros dialectic comes up occasionally in Nick Land's book Fanged Noumena, which deals a lot with accelerationism. I spent a while trying to wrap my head around how exactly Land incorporates Thanatos here, and the best I got was this passage, which I'm still struggling to make sense of. Inorganic Thanatos wrecks order, organic Eros preserves it, and as the carbon dominium is softened up by machine plague, deterritorializing replicants of nomad cyber revolution come in upon the re-territorializing reproducers of the sedentary human security system, hacking into the macropod. Libidinal materialism. This concept is also related to Nick Land's work. Land wants to move towards a philosophy that is non-intentional or non-teleological, which mirrors Deleuze and Guattari in that it conceptualizes desire not as a lack, a representation, or intention, as Freud would understand it, but as its own productive force. Desire is seen as a kind of energetic flow. An intro to Bataille that isn't porn. So Bataille is famous for incorporating transgressive ideas into his work for the sake of it, in order to break free from the expectations and norms of society and culture. One of Bataille's most famous works, that's probably the starting point for a lot of people, is The Story of the Eye, which was initially interpreted by the public as pure pornography because of its strong themes and depictions of bizarre sexual perversions. Since then, scholars have started to interpret this story a bit more charitably and see that it also has the same philosophical depth of a lot of his nonfiction work. The Lemurian Time War. So this one is pretty out there. This idea is associated with the CCRU, or the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit, which was a collective of cultural theorists prominent in the 90s, and some important figures associated with this collective include Sadie Plant and none other than Nick Land. The Lemurian Time War has its origins in a fictional story by William S. Burroughs, The Ghost Lemurs of Madagascar. This story involves a character who finds a free libertarian colony who seem to uphold lemurs as divine beings. The story involves a lot of time and space fuckery with these lemurs, like the passage, "Ring-tailed cat lemurs appeared parading back and forth around one another, tails quivering about their heads. Then whisk, they were gone, drawing back the space they had been away with them." These lemurs are described as thinking and feeling in a fundamentally different way from humans, in a way that's not oriented towards time and sequence and causality. The CCRU saw this as a kind of literary metaphor for a Kantian view, which understands space and time as forms of intuition, which structure our experience, but aren't aspects of fundamental reality itself. The Lemurian Time War piece by the CCRU is about William S. Burroughs' involvement in an occult time war. This fictional story is understood as a hyperstition, which I talked about earlier. It's a fiction that reaches out into the real world by influencing the course of cultural evolution as a self-fulfilling prophecy. Evidence for this time war is provided to the CCRU by a source they call William K., who claimed that the ghost lemurs of Madagascar was a decisive influence on the military career of Captain Mission, who lived 3 centuries previously. This process involves a kind of rewriting of the past, where the past is retrofitted in a process of retroactive causality. From Nick Land's perspective, this is all very related to Nietzsche's idea of eternal recurrence, which is the concept that the universe and all of existence has been recurring over and over, and will continue to recur an infinite number of times. K-War. This is an idea that comes up a couple times in Nick Land's Fanged Noumena. I couldn't really find a precise definition, but here's how it's described in the introduction. The insurrectionary basis for revolution now lies in the virtual terminus of capital, the future as transcendental unconscious, its return inhibited by the repressed circuits of temporality. Psychoanalysis is fascism. I think this is a reference to Deleuze and Guattari's development of schizoanalysis in opposition to psychoanalysis, which I talked about a bit earlier. They believed that in psychoanalysis, the psychoanalyst has a very authoritarian role in relation to the patient, which might be seen as a parallel to the authoritarianism of fascism. Hypervirus. This is also another reference to a concept in Nick Land's work. A hypervirus is kinda like a regular biological virus in that it infects parts of some larger structure. A hypervirus infects portions of a whole, which turn each of those portions into factories of itself, potentially replicating endlessly. Capitalism is artificial intelligence. This is in reference to an interview with Nick Land on Vimeo called What is Accelerating? Nick Land says the following: "I think capitalism and artificial intelligence are the same thing. It's the same process. Capitalism can only be artificial intelligence production, and artificial intelligence can only come out of self-propelling capitalism. You're not understanding either if you don't see that they're ultimately identical." Spinoza invented the rhizome. I think this part is in reference to Deleuze's connection to Spinoza. Deleuze really admired Spinoza's philosophy and inherited a lot of his ideas, like his approach to ontology. I couldn't figure out exactly how Spinoza's influence on Deleuze is related to rhizomes, though. Maybe it's just some kind of chain of dependency, where if you don't have Spinoza, you don't have Deleuze, and if you don't have Deleuze, you don't have rhizomes. D.C. Barker is real. From what I could tell, D.C. Barker, or Daniel Charles Barker, is a hyperstitional character created by the CCRU, which was that collection of intellectuals Nick Land was a part of. He can either be understood as a psychological construct of various people who pretend to treat him as real, or as some kind of magical, free-floating quasi-consciousness. Barker is described as a former professor of anorganic semiotics at Kingsport College, who was trained as a cryptographer in the 1970s and spent his career working in archaeology, mathematical semiotics, anatomical linguistics, and informatic engineering. This description of his life is also paired with a list of publications. I tried to research all of these publications, but the only website it pointed to was the list I found them on, describing D.C. Barker in the first place. Hicks is correct about postmodernism. This is in reference to the book Explaining Postmodernism by Stephen Hicks, which is the main source of Jordan Peterson's critique of postmodernism. Matt McManus criticized this book, claiming it misrepresents a lot of Western philosophy and includes a lot of misreadings, suppositions, rhetorical hyperbole, and sometimes even straight-up errors. If you want a deep dive into the problems with this reading of postmodernism, CCK Philosophy has a really good video about it. I don't want to spend too much time reiterating his points here. Neo-Leviathans. From what I researched, this concept is from a book being written on a website called Ortis Journal by someone who calls himself Meta Spinoza, aka Ulysse Malcoeur, aka Thousand Grugo. I haven't read this whole book, so I'm not an expert on the work of Meta Spinoza, but this is the passage I could find where he describes the concept of Neo-Leviathan. The concept of the Neo-Leviathan is not complicated. It is a state in crisis, in genuine crisis, doing whatever it needs to do to survive. In a world where the politics of the armed lifeboat have become truly hegemonic. They do not appear because evil gains the upper hand, but because of the cascading collapse of the globally integrated capitalist system. They emerge by a cold and calculated necessity, failing here, succeeding there, with the full-throated support of the body politic, the ones that survive anyway. He also describes some examples of Neo-Leviathans, which include 3D printed guns, gene editing technology, deepfakes, mass surveillance and identification, and personalized advertising technology. The pneumogram. The pneumogram is another Nicoland-adjacent concept. From what I could tell, the pneumogram is a variant of Kabbalah, which is an esoteric school of thought in Jewish mysticism. In this discipline, there's a concept of Sephirot, which are the 10 emanations and attributes of God, which God uses to continually sustain the existence of the universe. The pneumogram, in contrast, is based on 9 emanations instead of 10, and this change is based on numerology, which is the supposed divine or mystical significance of numbers. This concept of the pneumogram apparently ties into the CCRU's work on hyperstition in the Lemurian Time War. Capital is 0. I honestly tried my best, but I could not find anything about this. My best guess is that it might be referring to Z-AC, or Z-accelerationism, which means zero accelerationism, which is a sect of accelerationism that counterintuitively does not want to accelerate anything at all. The CCRU does not, has not, and will never exist. This is the idea that the CCRU, the collective related to Nicoland that I've been talking about here, is not real. I couldn't find any information about this online, but my best guess is that it's a joke playing on the concept of hyperstition within the CCRU, where the CCRU itself is being understood as a fiction that became reality. Laborde Clinic was a test for societies of control. The Laborde Clinic was a psychiatric clinic in France, and Guattari worked there for a while in the mid-50s, developing the theory of schizoanalysis. This entry in the meme seems to claim that rather than developing schizoanalysis, Guattari used his time there at the clinic to test societies of control. Hassan-i-Sabah magic as a line of flight. Excuse my pronunciation here, but Hassan-i-Sabah was a historical figure in Iran who founded the military group known as the Order of Assassins, who were a sect of Shia Islam who lived in the mountains of Persia and Syria between 1090 and 1275. Fun fact, apparently the term assassination is based on the tactics of this group. This group incorporated a style of mysticism which involved the idea that the physical and social world are not true or real in comparison to the higher reality of Allah. so therefore the laws of this material world are rendered null. Line of flight is a concept in Deleuze and Guattari, which comes from their work Capitalism and Schizophrenia. A line of flight is a fluid abstraction that doesn't follow any kind of set trajectory. It's understood as a kind of mutation or potential that manifests itself, giving a different form to desire that transcends categorization or interpretation. This entry in the meme claims that the Islamic mysticism of Hassan Isabah can be understood as a Deleuzian line of flight. Ligotti praxis. Thomas Ligotti is a contemporary horror writer. His work is often called weird fiction and has themes of philosophical horror. The most famous of his books is The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, which is a collection of essays that explores philosophical pessimism and antinatalism. I talked about antinatalism in level 2, and it's basically the idea that in existence, suffering outweighs pleasure, so the existence of conscious life is seen as a tragedy. Praxis is a process where a theory or idea is enacted or realized. So Ligottian praxis is presumably an enaction of antinatalist and pessimistic views, which might include things like choosing not to have children. Nick Land is two people. I couldn't find anything about this online, but it might refer to the stark differences between Nick Land's early and later work. Most of the Landian ideas I've talked about in this video are from his early period, but later on he really started to emphasize some controversial ideas, like being against egalitarianism, association with the alt-right and white supremacy, quote-unquote scientific racism and eugenics, which he called hyper-racism. In the later era of the CCRU, Nick Land was described as being antisocial and very reliant on amphetamines, which caused a lot of his academic associates to distance themselves from him. Eventually, he left his academic position because he was accused of dealing drugs to a student. Perhaps this later era of Nick Land wasn't Nick Land at all, but some kind of impersonator. The Hegel green text is true. This refers to a semi-popular green text from 4chan about Hegel being the Antichrist. I'll just read it out. That feel when you realize that Hegel is the true mastermind, even from beyond the grave. That feel when you find out about Hegel's occult interests and his connections with Hermeticism. That feel when you realize that the dialectic is a magical spell. That feel when you realize that Marx was puppeteered from beyond the grave by Hegel's terrible sorcery. That feel when you realize that the entire 20th century was controlled by Hegel's magic. Hegel is the Antichrist. October 31st, 1831, Hegel is witnessed to have burst into flames and disappeared from this earth. Writings found outlining spirits' corruption by evil, satanic altar, books burned, satanic Hegelian rituals outlawed, erased, Dark Triad 666. The Cathy Newman interview was part of the Lemurian Time War. The Cathy Newman interview was an interview in 2018 between the English journalist Cathy Newman and Jordan Peterson, where they discussed gender equality, the gender pay gap, freedom of speech, and transgender rights. This was one of the early viral videos that helped propel Jordan Peterson to fame, because there were a number of short clips and meme phrases that spread from this video, including the phrase, "So you're saying?" which Cathy Newman uttered 35 times during the interview. This entry of the meme claims that this interview was part of the Lemurian Time War, which, as strange as it sounds, does kind of make sense in the logic of the CCRU. This interview was one of the primary things that catapulted Jordan Peterson to fame, and it's undeniable that he's been a major influence on culture in recent times, for better or worse. Maybe some agent of the future or our current time used psychic magic to rewrite the past in order to make this interview happen, which would make Peterson famous and change the lives of 18-year-old boys everywhere who just don't want to clean their rooms. Asifal was the first CCRU. So Asifal was the name of a publication and secret society created by Georges Bataille, who were all very interested in the ideas of Bataille, Nietzsche, Freud, and Marquis de Sade, somewhat related to Bataille's idea of limit experiences, but also due to the Nazi occupation of France at the time. there were apparently discussions of carrying out a human sacrifice. The story goes that many of the members offered themselves as a sacrifice, but none of the members actually wanted to carry it out and do the killing part, so the human sacrifice never ended up happening. This entry in the meme claims that this secret society was the first CCRU. The only connection I can think of between the two is that they both incorporate non-fiction theory alongside fiction and art. Asafal was not only concerned with philosophy and sociology, but also with the works of fiction by Bataille and Marquis de Sade. For the CCRU, a lot of their theory directly incorporates fiction like cyberpunk and gothic horror. 10tricks.never and the CCRU.
выбросил в атмосферу огромное количество радиоактивных веществ, которые распространились по значительной части Европы. Больше всего пострадали Украина, Белоруссия и Россия.